So it gave birth to your novel, The Janissary Tree, the one we started off talking about,
Yep.
having won the Edgar Award. For all these people who probably haven't been there and haven't thought about these issues. So it must be a cracking good story if it won a prize.
Oh.
In spite of all that, what got you, what
Well,
got you going?
I'll tell you, there were several things involved in this. I mean, I'd written history, I'd written travel books, and I'd written histories, and I just thought, one day I thought, well, okay, would it be fun? It would be fun to try and do something else, to try and just write stories. In fact, one day I sat down and I tried to write started to write a thriller about a squashy sort of substance which I call Codestone. So I spent a day writing that book, and it was very exciting. Somebody driving up Bond Street and the bomb went off and the glass shattered, And then the very next day, I came in and just bypassed this and started to write The Janissary Tree. It's quite odd in a way. It was just something that had been in the back of my mind, and I wasn't going to write I just wasn't going to write this modern day thriller about Codestone. Good idea, though. I reserved that one, and I literally sat down and began to write this story. But a number of things that had sort of been whirling in my head. The idea of Istanbul, the idea of that as a place for setting a detective story, setting a crime story. I'd already kind of envisaged the idea of my detective, Yashim, as a eunuch. And I'd already sort of thought that that's what he would be, because that would allow him to be inside the harem, because the eunuchs were sort of go-betweens between the private world of the Sultan, his household, and the outside world, and they could go between those two worlds at will. So what better than to be a eunuch, because he could then investigate things which were on the inside, he could talk to women, and he could also go and talk to people in the street. So those two things were settled, but I hadn't hit on the date. I didn't know when would he be, perhaps during the reign of Solomon the Magnificent, 16th century, Ottomans on the roll, expanding all through Europe, lots of skullduggery in the harem there. Or would he be, I don't know, 1730s, the tulip period, when the Ottoman court went crazy for tulips. It was a wonderful, wonderful sort of decade when they, that was the period when they had, lovely parties and tulips all around them and put in little bottles, and they had giant turtles with candelabra on their back and kind of waddling amongst the tulips as they all drank sherbet and listened to beautiful music. That you could have quite a good...
Sounds like a film.
Yeah, I mean, you could have fun
a
there.
bad film.
Sounds like it's a sort of, it could be awful, but it could have been those times, and yet they weren't sort of quite grabbing me, and then I thought, 1830s. That's it, because, well, as you were referring earlier on, this was the moment when, the Ottomans were forced to face up to the fact that they weren't winning anymore. Things weren't going well for them. What was it that the Europeans had that they didn't have? So this Mahmud II became a reformer. He decided that he had to introduce sort of French drill for the soldiers and put them into proper European uniforms and get all that, and reform the navy, reform the tax system. I mean, it did become a huge, great program which lasted through the 19th century. Ultimately, perhaps didn't fully succeed. But what better than to have this push for reform, and meanwhile the tradition is pulling back. So not only have you got Istanbul as a line of fault between the East and the West, and the world of the steppe and the world of the Mediterranean, but you've also got it between, it's one foot in the future and one in the past. And
absolutely.
That's such a sort of tense and exciting sort of period. And
Plus you've got these great characters like the Valide Sultana we've already mentioned. Who are the Janissaries?
So the Janissaries of the title are, they were the Sultan's own, they were the imperial guard, if you like. I mean, there were many of them, 20,000 or so. I mean, there were many regiments of them. And they were initially, right back in the early days of the empire, they were Christian boys who were taken from their villages in the Balkans mostly, and they were brought into Anatolia, which is modern-day sort of Turkey on the Asian side. They were then converted to Islam, which is a very simple process. You just have to profess the creed, and they learned Turkish, and if they were tough and if they were kind of hunks, they'd be sent off to join the army, and if they were show that they were very bright and good looking and rather graceful and whatever, and sort of had aptitude, they might be sent to the palace schools to become the pashas, the to work their way up through the hierarchy in the palace and the bureaucracy, and they could ultimately end up being the Sultan's second in command, the Grand Vizier. And the Grand Vizier would be the guy who really directed the affairs of the empire. So you had this extraordinary thing with it, that the Ottomans, the early Ottomans, were taking, as it were, the sort of the most sort of energetic of their subjects and shaping them exactly as they wanted to. Some would go and become janissaries, and they would become the shock troops of the empire. Some would go on to become the directors and managers and whatever of the empire. And these janissaries were very successful for many years, but it declined. A lot of things in the empire began to decline around the sort of 1600s, and slowly, the janissaries were much more compromised. They wouldn't turn up when they were called up to go to war. They married. They initially weren't allowed to marry, so of course they married. They had kids. They decided that they often weren't at war, so they might open a little shop in the Grand Bazaar and run it as have a shop there and so on. They had lots of privileges because they were a sort of a special group, so they abused those privileges. And slowly they became this really interesting. Writing about this in the history book, Lords of the Horizons, is one thing, but articulating it in a story like the Janissary Tree is another. And there's more. Funny enough, there's sort of things you can say in a kind of a sort of ripping yarn about them. That you can't really say in a sort of kind of official history book, as it were, in a sort of kind of serious history book. So, in some ways, they were trouble, and they were scary, and they scared the authorities, and they become sort of too powerful. On the other hand, they were a sort of mind canary. Their whistling was a sign that things weren't going well. So they sort of spoke for the people in some ways too. Then again, the people disliked them because they had all these privileges, and they did amazing things, like they would billet themselves on a sort of family, and as they were sort of marching to or fro, they'd say, right, we're going to stay the night here, and then they would tax that family. They take a contribution from that family the next morning, which they would call tooth rent, which was for the grinding of their teeth that they'd done when they ate this poor peasant family's food. I mean, they were scoundrels. But yet many of them were artists and
Right.
poets and so on. I think it's really interesting people.
But they were a force kind of their own. So
Yeah.
when you write your book, what's happened to the Janissaries?
So the story, as it were, curtain goes up in 1836, and that's important because it's the 10th anniversary or nearabouts of an event which finished the Janissary power off for good. Mahmud knew that he would never be able to reform his empire as long as these Janissaries were there, because of course they had the privilege. Everything about the Ancien regime suited them very well. So he had to get rid of them, and he did it very slowly and very cleverly. It took him many years to get things into position, but ultimately he provoked them into an uprising. They were often did so. They would overturn these huge cauldrons they had and start banging on them, and the noise of the cauldrons banging meant all Istanbul knew that the Janissaries were mutinying. And on this particular occasion, instead of giving way to their demands or sending out pashas to be hanged on the Janissary tree, which was a big tree, great plane tree that stood in Istanbul, and quite often, as a witness said, so full of the bodies of hanged men that it was a sickening sight to look on. I mean, it was they were summary justice from this tree. So instead, they assembled around the tree and so on. But instead of giving in, the Sultan unleashed his modernized artillery. The French had been helping him sort of update the artillery, and they just bombarded the Janissaries. They retreated to their barracks in Istanbul, and they were pounded to pieces. Some of them escaped, of course. A lot of them were hunted down and killed in the next few days. But ultimately, that was it. They were finished. They were certainly spent as a political force. But 10 years goes by. There were some rumblings. There were perhaps some people who had escaped.
Kind of neo-Nazi, wasn't it?
That's the sort of premise, I suppose, of the book, of the Janissary Tree, that maybe, as it were, the forces of reaction are gathering secretly.
Well, and reasonably so, given the way history works and the way the city worked. So you've got a murder, you've got Yashim, you've got the Janissaries who may be resurgent, or at least some of them. The Janissaries, in a way, although totally tamed down, I guess you could find a bit of a modern analog in the Swiss Guards at the Vatican. Well, I mean,
Well, let's hope the Swiss guards don't go sort of berserk.
but I mean, what you have are people from the outside
Yeah,
who,
that's
are
true.
there to form a kind of circle around the
Yeah.
Pope, and I mean,
Yeah.
the Janissaries in their, original
Yeah.
form were, as you say, a bodyguard